The desert stretched wide, an endless horizon of ochre and bone where the sun burned down on men without mercy. Heat shimmered across the plains, and the dust rose beneath the hooves of a weary horse. On its saddle sat a figure who carried both the dust of the road and the shadows of a past not easily shaken. His name was Ethan Crow, a cowboy without a home, a man whose silence spoke louder than his gun. He rode into Dead Man's Creek as though drawn by some fate he hadn't chosen, the town's crooked signs swaying on rusty chains above the entrance like a warning to all who dared step inside. Strangers in this land were measured quickly, by the tilt of their hat, the grit in their stare, the weight of their silence. Ethan carried all three, and that was enough to make whispers follow him the moment his boots hit the dirt street. Old men on porches narrowed their eyes, mothers pulled their children aside, and card players paused mid-hand at the saloon window. Dead Man's Creek was a place where outsiders either bent or broke, and everyone knew it. Before the tale deepens, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this story. Every twist, every decision, every battle for pride and redemption. Stay with us until the very end. The saloon doors creaked open, spilling out the sour scent of whiskey and the twang of an off-key piano. Inside, the air was thick with cigar smoke, laughter too sharp to be joyful, and the rustle of cards slapped against wooden tables. Ethan's spurs clinked against the floor as he stepped inside, his eyes scanning with the caution of a man who'd seen too much. He ordered nothing, said nothing, and for a moment it seemed as though he might pass through unnoticed. But silence in Dead Man's Creek had a way of being broken. From the far end of the saloon came a laugh, loud, heavy, full of the kind of confidence that came only from power. The crowd parted in glances rather than steps, revealing a woman whose presence filled more than the room. Martha Hargrove, known to all as Big M, sat enthroned in her corner chair, her wide frame draped in layers of dark fabric, her fingers glittering with rings that caught the lamplight, her eyes, sharp as broken glass, locked on Ethan with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "Well now," she said, her voice rolling deep, every word dripping with authority. "Look what the desert dragged in. Another saddle tramp thinking he can ride through without paying his respects." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The room grew quieter, as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. Martha rose, slow and deliberate, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight. She was a woman mocked in whispers for her size, yet none dared laugh within earshot. Power wrapped around her like a cloak, and fear kept it fastened tight. "You hear me, cowboy?" she called, her voice carrying over the clatter of glasses. "I said strip and kneel. That's the price of stepping onto my land. Every man who rides through Dead Man's Creek knows better than to cross me." A ripple of uneasy laughter rolled through the saloon, the kind that masks fear more than joy. All eyes turned to Ethan. His hand hovered near his revolver, not to draw, but as though the weight of it steadied his pride. He lifted his gaze toward Martha, meeting her eyes without flinching. "I didn't come here to kneel," he said, his voice low but steady. The room stiffened. A glass shattered in someone's nervous grip. Martha's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "Then you'll learn quick, stranger," she said, her tone heavy with promise. "No man rides into Dead Man's Creek without bowing to me, one way or another." The piano player's hands stilled. The smoke hung heavy. Ethan stood in the center of the saloon, his shadow stretching long beneath the lamplight. Knowing he had just placed himself in the center of a storm he could neither ride past nor outrun. Morning light fell across Dead Man's Creek like a thin blade of gold, sharp and unforgiving. Dust swirled in the streets where wagon wheels carved ruts into the hard earth, and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance reminded everyone who truly held the town in her grip. Martha Hargrove owned the water, the pastures and the roots that kept men fed and animals alive. Without her permission, nothing moved. Without her blessing, no one prospered. Ethan Crow walked the main street with his hat pulled low, eyes scanning the faces that watched him from porches and windows. He felt the weight of their stares like invisible chains. Suspicion mingled with fear. Whispers followed him still, the stranger who had defied Big M inside her own saloon. At the blacksmith's, a hammer struck iron in a steady rhythm, sparks leaping into the air like fleeting stars. The smith, a thick-armed man named Hollis, looked up briefly when Ethan passed but offered no greeting. Across the street, a pair of boys stopped tossing a worn leather ball and quickly ducked behind a barrel, as though simply being seen near him carried danger. Ethan understood the message. In Dead Man's Creek, one either bent knee to Martha or risked being crushed beneath her heel. By midday, The sun blazed down with a punishing heat. Ethan stopped at the well in the center of town, reaching for the rope. An old man bent nearly double with age hissed from a nearby bench, "Best leave that be, son." "That water ain't free." Ethan straightened, his hand still gripping the rope. "What do you mean? It's a well, isn't it?" The old man spat into the dirt. "It's her well, same as the river, the cattle trails, the feed. You drink without asking. You'll answer to Martha." Ethan let go of the rope slowly, his throat burning dry as sand. A boy ran past carrying a bucket, glancing nervously behind him as though expecting someone to snatch it away. Ethan understood then that thirst itself had been turned into a weapon in Dead Man's Creek. Later, he found himself outside the general store. A painted sign swung lazily above the entrance, its letters faded by wind and time. Inside, the smell of flour and dried beans mixed with leather and tobacco. The storekeeper, a lean man with sharp cheekbones, paused mid-measure as Ethan entered. His hands trembled just enough to betray his unease. "You'll find what you need, but you best pay quick," the man said. "And don't think credit's an option, not with her watching." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "She's got every pocket in this town turned inside out?" The storekeeper's lips pressed tight and he looked away. "Careful how you speak. Walls have ears, and so do men who'd trade a word for a coin." The bell above the door jingled. A tall ranch hand in a wide-brimmed hat stepped inside, his chest puffed with arrogance. He bought nothing, said nothing, only gave Ethan a slow, measuring look before leaving. The warning was clear. Outsiders weren't welcome. That night, Ethan sat outside the livery stable, watching the last colors of dusk bleed into the desert sky. His horse shifted restlessly, sensing its rider's unease. The air smelled of dust and manure, but beneath it lingered something heavier, fear that clung to the town like smoke after a fire. He thought of Martha's words in the saloon, of her demand that he kneel. In the silence, he heard them again, louder, as if the land itself repeated them. Pride burned in his chest, but with it came the sharp edge of worry. Every step he took here was watched. Every breath was measured against her will. The desert wind howled through the alleys, rattling loose shutters and whispering against the walls. Ethan pulled his coat tighter, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the mountains loomed like sleeping giants. He wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. But already he knew. Dead Man's Creek was a land where survival meant bending, and bending was something Ethan Crow had never learned to do. The next morning came with the sound of cattle lowing from the outskirts and the clink of iron pots as women prepared bread in clay ovens. Dead Man's Creek woke slowly, but one name echoed in every corner of the town: Martha Hargrove. Her influence was not a rumor whispered in alleys, but a truth carved deep into the marrow of the place. Martha had not been born into power. Her story was told in fragments, bits of gossip traded over whiskey, pieces of truth mixed with lies. She was said to have grown up the daughter of a poor trapper, surviving winters on scraps and mule meat, her body growing broad and strong from labor rather than luxury. When she married Thomas Hargrove, the wealthiest rancher for 100 miles, most thought she had struck gold. But when Thomas was thrown from a horse and buried under a sky black with storm, it was Martha who refused to hand the land to lawyers or to Thomas's weak-blooded cousins. She seized it for herself, and from that day forward, Dead Man's Creek bent to her will. Now she sat in her parlor at the edge of town, surrounded by thick velvet curtains that shut out the desert glare. Silver trays of biscuits and steaming coffee filled the table, though few dared eat without her bidding. Men twice her size waited at her command, hats in hand, their eyes fixed on the floor. She had no sheriff's badge, no governor's seal, yet her word carried the weight of law. When Ethan entered that room for the first time, invited or rather summoned by a messenger boy with trembling hands, he carried himself with the wary calm of a man walking into a lion's den. Martha's gaze locked onto him at once, sharp and steady. She didn't bother to rise. "So," she said, her voice smooth as molasses but heavy with the weight of authority. "The proud rider who thinks himself too fine to kneel. Do you know why men obey me, Mr. Crow?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He studied the men flanking her chair, the glint of rifles resting nearby, the faint tremor in one man's jaw, as if even he feared what she might say next. Finally, Ethan spoke. "Fear," he said simply. Martha's lips curved into something close to a smile. "You think fear alone rules a town?" "No. Fear breaks a man once. Respect keeps him broken. Every farmer drinks my water. Every rancher uses my trails. They might curse me when they're alone, But when they see this ring on my finger, they remember who lets them eat." She raised her hand, showing the golden band that once belonged to Thomas. It gleamed like a crown. "So you've built an empire," Ethan said, his voice low. "But an empire made of dust can't last." A ripple of laughter burst from the men around her, though their eyes flicked nervously to Martha before they dared join in. She didn't laugh. She studied Ethan, her stare sinking into him as if peeling back his skin. "You've got a tongue sharp enough to cut," she said. "But words are lighter than ash in a desert wind. I give you this choice again, bend and live. Refuse and the sand will swallow your bones. Even a gunman can't outshoot thirst." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence could be its own form of defiance. Martha leaned back, her chair groaning under her weight. "Stubborn," she murmured. "I like stubborn. It breaks louder when it finally snaps." The air in the parlor thickened with tension, the smell of coffee turning bitter on Ethan's tongue. He felt every eye on him, waiting to see if he would yield or resist. Yet deep within, he knew his path had already been chosen. As he turned to leave, Martha's voice followed him like a brand on the air. "Mark me, cowboy. Deadman's Creek doesn't remember the proud, only the obedient." The morning sun rose clear and bright over Deadman's Creek, yet the town seemed weighed down by shadows no light could burn away. Ethan Crow walked through the narrow street, boots crunching over grit, his mind heavy with Martha Hargrove's words. Her grip on the land was like a vice, and he felt it every step he took. But in a place where fear shaped men, he wondered if any dared resist her at all. That question found its answer in a voice that carried with steady calm across the dusty yard behind the church. "You don't look like a man who bows easy." Ethan turned. A woman stood with a book in her hands, her face framed by a plain bonnet that shaded sharp eyes. Clara Boone was not a woman of power in the traditional sense. Widowed young, she had stayed in Deadman's Creek to teach children their letters when most would have fled. Her dress was simple, dust clinging to its hem, but her presence carried a quiet strength stronger than rifles. "I've heard talk," Clara continued, stepping closer. "You stood your ground in the saloon. Most men wouldn't dare." Ethan studied her, wary of words dressed as kindness. "Talk spreads quicker than prairie fire in a town like this." "Then let it spread," Clara said firmly. "Someone needs to remind folks that Martha's rule isn't law. It's fear dressed up as authority. And fear can be broken." Her eyes burned with conviction, and Ethan felt something stir in him, though he didn't speak it aloud. He had come to Deadman's Creek searching only for a place to rest, but already he was entangled in its tangled loyalties. Clara Boone, with her steady gaze, seemed to see beyond the dust on his boots and the shadow on his past. The sound of laughter broke their moment. Across the yard, leaning against the hitching post, stood a man with broad shoulders and a rifle resting casual in his hands. Jed Hargrove, Martha's nephew, wore the kind of grin that never reached the eyes. He had inherited none of Martha's size, but all of her cruelty, sharpened into something young and mean. "Well, well," Jed drawled, spitting tobacco into the dirt. "The widow Boone preaching courage to strangers. Careful, Clara, that kind of talk can get a body hurt." Clara's spine stiffened. "Teaching children right from wrong isn't dangerous, Jed, unless you're afraid they'll learn." Jed's grin widened, though his eyes flickered toward Ethan with cold intent. "And you," the drifter with too much pride. "Martha says you're trouble. I say you're a fool. You think you can ride in here and spit in the dust she built her name on? You'll find this town don't take kindly to heroes." Ethan met his stare without flinching. "Don't recall calling myself a hero." "Don't matter what you call yourself," Jed snapped. He shifted the rifle on his shoulder, his tone dripping with menace. "Sooner or later you'll either kneel or you'll bleed. And I'll be the one to make sure of it." The silence that followed was thick as tar. Clara's hand tightened on the book she held, her knuckles white. Ethan's pulse steadied, not quickened, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his readiness. Jed smirked, spitting once more before turning to leave. "Enjoy your strolls with the widow while you can, cowboy. Ain't much left of a man once Martha's through with him." As he walked away, Clara released a breath she had been holding. Ethan glanced at her, his voice low but steady. "You've got fire enough to stand against her," he said. "And you've got pride enough to make her burn hotter," Clara replied. "Maybe together that means something." The church bell tolled in the distance, the sound rolling across the town like a warning. Ethan knew then that Deadman's Creek was not just a place to pass through. It was a place where choices dug deep into the earth, binding men and women alike. Ethan Crow rose early, the sky still painted in the faint blush of dawn. He had spent the night restless, thoughts of Clara Boone's courage clashing with Jed Hargrove's threats. A town strangled by fear needed more than words, yet Ethan knew better than most that a man's choices carved his fate deeper than bullets. That morning, he chose work. Work was honest, silent, and far removed from the tangled webs of pride and power. The livery smelled of hay and horse sweat, the sound of hooves stamping in stalls echoing through the dim light. Ethan stepped inside, removing his hat, and approached the keeper, a stout fellow with thinning hair named Riley. "I'm looking for work," Ethan said. "Don't need much pay, just a roof for me and my horse." Riley's hands paused on the bridle he was oiling. His eyes darted toward the door, then back to Ethan. "I'd take you on," he muttered, "but I can't. Word came down last night. Big M don't want no part of you earning an honest dime here." Ethan's jaw tightened. "She owns the livery too." Riley shook his head, shame flickering across his face. "No, but she owns the water and she owns the grain. What's a stable without those?" "You see the bind I'm in?" Ethan nodded slowly, his throat dry with a bitterness that had nothing to do with thirst. "I see it clear." As he stepped outside, the town was already stirring. Wagons rattled down the street, children ran barefoot in the dust, and the clatter of pans rang from open windows. Yet every face turned away from him as he passed, like shutters slamming against a storm. At the corner near the saloon, a drunken cowboy stumbled from the porch. His shirt was half unbuttoned, his beard stained with whiskey, and his laughter cut sharp through the morning air. "Well, if it ain't the proud rider," the man slurred, blocking Ethan's path. "The one who wouldn't bend to Martha. Think you're better than the rest of us, don't you?" Ethan kept his tone level. "I ain't looking for trouble." "Trouble found you, stranger," the man sneered, swinging a fist. The blow grazed Ethan's jaw, the taste of copper blooming on his tongue. Instinct screamed for him to reach for the Colt at his side, but he held back. The crowd that had begun to gather leaned in, hungry for violence, eager to see what the defiant cowboy would do. Ethan straightened, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and met the man's bloodshot eyes. Then, with a calm steadiness that cut sharper than any bullet, he stepped aside. "Find yourself another fight," Ethan said. The drunk lunged again, but Ethan caught his wrist, twisted it just enough to break the momentum, and shoved him back into the dust. Gasps rippled through the bystanders, their shock louder than the scuffle itself. No gun had been drawn, no blood spilled. Ethan had ended the fight without killing a man, a rarity in Dead Man's Creek, where pride and steel usually sealed disputes. The drunk scrambled up, muttering curses, and staggered off toward the saloon. The crowd lingered a moment longer, whispering. Some looked disappointed, others curious. A few seemed almost impressed. Ethan adjusted his hat and walked on, the murmurs following him like shadows. Inside, he felt a strange pull between relief and unease. By refusing to draw, he had denied Martha the spectacle she no doubt expected, yet he also knew restraint carried its own risks. In a land where men respected only force, showing mercy could be mistaken for weakness. Still, as he walked past the churchyard and caught sight of Clara Boone speaking to a cluster of children, he felt a flicker of something rare. Perhaps, in holding back, he had sown a seed of change. The desert heat lingered long after sunset, clinging to the streets of Deadman's Creek like a second skin. Crickets hummed in the weeds near the churchyard, and lanterns flickered in windows as families settled into uneasy sleep. Ethan Crow sat on the porch of the boarding house, rolling a cigarette he never lit, watching shadows stretch across the town. Something about the night felt restless, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. It wasn't long before the silence broke. A shout pierced the air, followed by the acrid scent of smoke carried on the wind. Ethan stood at once, his hand brushing the Colt on his hip, though instinct told him this was no fight for bullets. He caught sight of orange light licking against the dark sky, the schoolhouse, its wooden frame glowing with fire. He ran. Boots pounded against hard-packed dirt as he closed the distance, heat growing sharper with every step. The fire roared greedily, swallowing dry timber, windows cracking under the blaze. Screams echoed inside. "Help us!" a small voice cried. Ethan didn't stop to think. He tore his coat from his shoulders, wrapped it around his arm, and drove his shoulder against the door. The old wood splintered, coughing out sparks and smoke. Inside, the air was thick and choking, the kind that clawed at lungs and burned eyes raw. Through the haze, he saw them. Children huddled beneath desks, their faces pale with terror. "Come on!" Ethan shouted, his voice ragged. He grabbed the nearest boy, pushing him toward the broken doorway. "Stay low, cover your mouths!" One by one he pulled them out, his muscles screaming, his throat raw with smoke. A little girl clung to his leg, sobbing, her tiny fingers refusing to let go. Ethan scooped her into his arms, teeth clenched against the heat that seemed to melt the world around him. Outside, townsfolk gathered, their faces lit by the fire's glow. Clara Boone was among them, her bonnet askew, shouting prayers and orders in the same breath. When Ethan stumbled out with the last child in his arms, she rushed forward, pulling the girl to safety. "You'll kill yourself in there," Clara cried, her voice thick with fear. "There's one more," Ethan barked, coughing hard. He turned before she could stop him. Back inside, the roof groaned under the weight of flames. Smoke clawed at his chest, each breath sharper than the last. At the far corner, hidden behind a collapsed beam, a boy whimpered. Ethan dragged the beam aside, seized the boy, and forced his way back out just as the roof gave way with a thunderous crack. The crowd erupted in shouts as Ethan emerged, carrying the boy against his chest. Clara ran to him, tears streaking her smoke-stained face. He handed the child into her arms, then doubled over, coughing until his ribs ached. The schoolhouse collapsed behind them, sparks shooting skyward like stars ripped from the heavens. All that remained was a smoldering skeleton of charred beams. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some spoke Ethan's name in awe, others in disbelief. Our stranger had risked his life to save their children. For the first time since his arrival, their eyes held something other than suspicion. Yet even as relief washed over them, Clara's voice cut through the murmurs, bitter with certainty. "This wasn't an accident." Ethan straightened, his chest still burning, his eyes narrowing. "You're saying someone set it?" Clara's gaze was hard. "Martha warned me. She said teaching children courage was dangerous. Now she's made her point." The fire crackled behind them, painting the night with ruin. Ethan stared into the embers, his fists clenched tight. If Martha meant to scare him, she had misjudged the man she challenged. Fear might rule Dead Man's Creek, but tonight, Ethan Crow had shown it could be fought. The smoke from the ruined schoolhouse still lingered in the air the next morning, curling above Dead Man's Creek, like a scar that wouldn't fade. The town had not slept easy. Children whimpered in their beds, parents whispered prayers, and men sat with rifles across their laps as if waiting for shadows to strike again. Ethan Crow rose early, though his lungs still ached from the fire. He walked the streets with a weight pressing down heavier than the desert sun, sensing the unease that followed him now, not as suspicion, but as expectation. At the edge of the general store, a man leaned against the post, his hat pulled low, dust clinging to his coat. Ethan knew at once he wasn't a rancher or farmer. The man's eyes told the truth, cold, assessing, carrying the patience of someone who had hunted before. "Morning, Crow," the stranger said, his voice carrying a rasp. "Or should I call you by the name on the posters?" Ethan froze, his blood running cold. Few men spoke of his past, and fewer still knew it. The man flicked a folded parchment open, the ink faded but clear. Ethan Crow. "Wanted in 3 counties for a bank raid in Abilene. Price on your head's dropped since then, but gold is gold." Ethan's jaw tightened. "That was years ago. Doesn't wash the stain," the man replied smoothly. "Once an outlaw, always an outlaw." People nearby slowed, listening. Whispers spread like wildfire, faster even than the blaze that had taken the schoolhouse. Ethan felt their stares on his back, hot with betrayal. Just yesterday they had seen him drag children from fire. Now they remembered he was not just a stranger, but a man with a shadow. Clara Boone stepped out from the store, clutching a sack of flour. Her eyes widened as she caught the parchment in the hunter's hand. "Is it true?" she asked softly. Ethan swallowed hard. For years he had buried the memory under layers of silence, but silence now would be worse than confession. He forced the words out, steady as he could. "I was there. Young, stupid, riding with men I should have never trusted. We robbed the bank, and people paid the price. But I walked away from that life, haven't drawn iron for crime since." The bounty hunter chuckled darkly. "Doesn't matter if you changed. A price is a price. Folks'll pay me for your hide one way or another." Clara's gaze held Ethan's, searching, as if weighing his soul in the balance. Finally she said, "You saved children from burning. That speaks louder to me than what you once were." Her voice was firm, yet sorrow lingered beneath it. The hunter smirked. "Noble words, but nobility don't pay debts." I'll give you till sundown, Crow. Either you come quiet or I take you dead. Makes no difference to me." He tipped his hat, then walked off toward the saloon, leaving the weight of his threat behind. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, but not without glances sharp as daggers. Some muttered about betrayal, others about debts long past due. The ground beneath Ethan felt less steady than ever, as though the desert itself was shifting against him. Clara stepped closer, lowering her voice. "What are you going to do?" Ethan's eyes darkened. "Can't run. If I run, Martha wins. If I stay, I face both her and my past." She touched his arm lightly, her hand trembling yet firm. "Then face it, Ethan. Don't let shame write your story for you. Show them who you are now, not who you were." Her words settled deep, heavy as iron yet steadying like water. Ethan tipped his hat, more to hide the turmoil in his face than as a gesture. Sundown would bring reckoning, but whether it meant freedom or chains, he didn't yet know. The desert evening settled heavy over Dead Man's Creek, the horizon bleeding into shades of red and violet. The town waited, silent and tense, as though it too expected something sharp to cut through the quiet. Ethan Crow stood by the boarding house steps, hat low over his brow, every muscle drawn tight. He had faced gunmen before, but this felt different. This wasn't just a fight against men. It was against the grip of a woman who held the town like a noose around its neck. The first sign came in the crunch of boots on gravel. Ethan's hand shifted toward his Colt. From the shadows emerged Jed Hargrove, rifle slung casual over his shoulder, flanked by two men with eyes flat and hungry. Behind them, another pair lingered in the dark, their outlines sharp against the lamplight. "Well now," Jed drawled, his grin wide, his voice carrying malice like it was sport. "Martha says you've been stirring up dust that don't belong to you. Funny thing about dust, it's easy to bury a man in it." Ethan's gaze stayed steady, though his pulse thudded in his chest. "If you've come for talk, you've wasted your boots." Jed laughed, motioning to his men. "Oh, we ain't here to talk. We're here to make sure Dead Man's Creek don't mistake you for something you ain't. You ain't no savior, Crow. You're just another outlaw hiding behind pride." The first shot rang out sudden, splintering the wood of the porch rail inches from Ethan's side. He dove off the steps, rolling into the dirt, the Colt drawn before he hit his knee. The men closed in, gunfire flashing against the night, sparks lighting the street like fireflies born of chaos. Ethan ducked behind a trough, bullets slamming into wood, splinters stinging his arms. He steadied his breathing, waiting. One of Jed's men rushed forward, pistol raised. Ethan fired once, the shot kicking dust at the man's boots, forcing him to stumble back. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. He needed to show strength, not blood. The street grew alive with shouts. Windows cracked open, faces peering out, townsfolk holding their breath as their fate played out in gunfire. Jed shouted curses, his voice shaking with fury. "You think you can play games with me?" he roared. "Come out and face me like a man." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He shifted low, circling around the trough, slipping into the shadows of the stable. He moved like a wolf among rocks, using the night as his shield. Jed's men fired blindly into the dark, their bullets chewing dirt and wood, but finding no flesh. From behind the stable wall, Ethan caught one man alone, fumbling with his revolver. Ethan slammed the butt of his Colt into the man's wrist, sending the gun clattering to the ground. A swift kick to the knee sent the outlaw sprawling, groaning in the dirt. The others turned at the cry, but Ethan was already gone, slipping deeper into shadow. Gunfire echoed, frantic and wild. Jed cursed again, rage mounting. "This ain't over, Crow," he bellowed into the night. "You hear me? You've picked a fight you can't finish. My aunt don't forgive, and she sure as hell don't forget." The men withdrew, dragging their wounded with them, their boots pounding against the street until the echoes faded. Silence crept back into Dead Man's Creek, heavy and uncertain. Ethan leaned against the stable wall, chest heaving, sweat mixing with dust. He had survived, but survival was only the beginning. Tonight proved Martha feared him enough to send her nephew and hired guns. That fear was dangerous. Dangerous, but also powerful. He holstered his Colt, eyes scanning the empty street. The town had watched, had seen him stand his ground without falling. The storm was far from over, but in its heart Ethan had learned something. Leadership wasn't born from drawing the quickest gun. It was born from refusing to kneel. The next dawn broke pale and uncertain, the desert wind carrying with it the faint smell of gunpowder still clinging to Dead Man's Creek. The night's violence had shaken the town, and though Ethan Crow had stood his ground, The silence of the morning felt heavier than victory. Men and women emerged from their homes slowly, eyes darting toward the street as though expecting Martha's men to return at any moment. Ethan walked with steady steps, though the weight of exhaustion pressed on his shoulders. He had not slept, his mind replaying every shot, every cry, every shadow that had moved against him in the dark. Yet what haunted him most was not the fight itself. It was the way the townsfolk had watched. Hidden behind shutters, peeking from windows, they had seen him resist, and now they would have to choose whether to turn away or to follow. At the edge of the well, he found Hollis the blacksmith, hammer resting idle against the anvil. Hollis wiped his brow and glanced around before speaking. "Word's going around, Crow. Some folks think you're stirring trouble. Others say you're the first man in years to stand up to her." Ethan met his gaze. "And what do you say?" Hollis hesitated, his calloused hands tightening on the hammer. "I say, men been bent too long in this town. You showed us a back can stay straight, but talk won't keep water in our buckets." The mention of water cut sharp. Every farmer, every rancher depended on Martha's wells and river rights. It was her iron grip on thirst itself that kept Dead Man's Creek bent. Ethan looked toward the dry earth beyond town, cracked and lifeless under the sun. An idea flickered, risky, backbreaking, but a spark of freedom. "If we dig a new well," Ethan said slowly, "we wouldn't need her water." Hollis frowned. "Ground's hard. Could take weeks, months even." "Better months of sweat than years of kneeling," Ethan answered. Behind them, Clara Boone approached, her face pale but her eyes steady. She had spent the morning with the children, calming their fears after the fire. When she heard Ethan's words, she nodded. "He's right," Clara said firmly. "This town will never be free until it provides for itself. Every day we drink her water, we drink her power." Others gathered as she spoke. Shopkeepers, ranch wives, field hands. Their faces were lined with fatigue, but something stirred in them, faint as an ember catching wind. Yet just as quickly, another voice rose sharp against it. "Dig a well?" sneered a man from the back of the crowd. "And when Martha finds out, what then? She'll burn more than the schoolhouse. She'll burn our homes. She'll starve us dry." Murmurs spread, fear dragging at the edges of hope. Some nodded at the warning. Others clenched their fists in silence. The town stood balanced on the edge of a knife. Ethan raised his voice, not loud, but steady enough to cut through. "She owns this town because we let her. She rules with water because no one's had the grit to claim their own. You keep bending, you'll break. But you dig with me, you'll stand." Clara stepped forward, her voice softer but carrying just as much weight. "We've seen what happens when fear rules our lives. Children nearly died because of it. How many more do we wait to bury before we say enough?" The crowd shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes, retreating into fear. But a few, just a few, nodded. Hollis lifted his hammer, resting it on his shoulder like a banner. "I'll dig," he said. The words hung in the air, fragile yet solid as iron. Ethan felt the balance tip, not fully, but enough. For the first time since he had ridden into Dead Man's Creek, hope had taken root. And Martha, somewhere beyond the horizon, would soon feel it stir against her rule. The midday sun bore down on Dead Man's Creek, heat shimmering off rooftops and turning the dust in the streets into a haze of gold. Ethan Crow stood near the half-dug well outside the church, sweat dripping from his brow as Hollis swung the hammer into stone. The work was slow, grueling, but every strike carried the weight of defiance. Men and women gathered, some to help, others to watch, their whispers blending with the rhythm of iron on rock. The sound broke when a group of riders thundered into town. At their front, in a wide wagon draped in dark cloth, sat Martha Hargrove herself. Her bulk filled the seat, her presence a wall of power that cast a shadow deeper than the sun could pierce. She was dressed in black velvet despite the heat, her rings glittering like small daggers of light. At her side sat Jed, eyes burning with the promise of revenge. The wagon stopped before the crowd. Silence fell so heavy, it smothered the sound of hammers and picks. Martha rose slowly, the boards creaking under her weight. Her gaze swept over the townsfolk, lingering last on Ethan. "Well now," she said, her voice rich and booming, "seems Dead Man's Creek has forgotten who holds the reins." "A well?" She spat the word like poison. "You think digging in dirt will free you from me? You think one stray outlaw can teach you to bite the hand that feeds?" The people shifted uneasily. Some lowered their eyes, others clenched their fists, but none spoke. Ethan stepped forward, dust clinging to his boots, his voice steady. No one feeds us but the land, he said, and the land don't belong to you, Martha. A sharp murmur rippled through the crowd. Jed bristled, his hand tightening on his rifle, but Martha raised one jeweled hand and stilled him. Her smile spread wide, though it carried no warmth. You've got a sharp tongue, Crow, she said, but tongues don't stop bullets. So here's my word, and I'll speak it plain. You kneel before me here and now for all to see. You admit you're nothing but a drifter who bit off more than he can chew. Do that and I'll let you leave this town alive. Refuse. Her smile faded into steel. And I'll grind this place into dust. Every man, every woman who stands with you will pay the price. The silence that followed was a living thing, heavy and smothering. All eyes turned to Ethan. Clara Boone's hand tightened around the Bible she carried, her lips pressed together as if holding back words. Hollis looked down at the hammer in his calloused grip, shame and defiance warring in his face. The crowd teetered between surrender and courage, between fear and freedom. Ethan's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. I've bent before in my life, Martha. Bent till I thought I'd never stand again. But I won't kneel to you, not now, not ever. The words struck the crowd like thunder. A few gasps escaped, but more than that, a low murmur of approval spread. It was faint, but it was there, the first flicker of resistance catching flame. Martha's eyes narrowed, her face hard as stone. Then you've chosen death, Cowboy, and not just yours. She turned her gaze on the people, her voice a lash. Every soul here who digs one more inch of that well will burn for it. She raised her hand, and the riders wheeled their horses, the wagon creaking as it turned. Dust clouded the air as they rode away, leaving the town in silence once more. But the silence no longer felt smothered. It throbbed with the echo of Ethan's words. Clara stepped to his side, her voice quiet but fierce. You've set the fire now, Ethan, and it'll burn until the end. The desert sky burned pale and merciless, the heat pressing down until even the air seemed too heavy to breathe. Dead Man's Creek stirred with unease, each corner of town alive with rumor. Martha's ultimatum had spread like fire through dry grass, kneel or be crushed. Some townsfolk clung to her shadow out of fear, while others found themselves whispering Ethan Crow's name, with a quiet reverence they hadn't expected to feel. But Martha did not wait for whispers to fade. Her answer came quickly, carried not in words, but in the smoke of burning crops. Fields outside the town smoldered, the blackened stalks of corn snapping in the wind like bones. Jed Hargrove and his men had ridden hard through the night, leaving behind scorched earth and broken fences. A rancher named Cole stumbled into town with blood on his lip and despair in his eyes, his hat clutched tight in his hands. They came at dawn, he rasped, voice trembling. Set fire to my fields, shot my cattle for sport. Said it was a taste of what's coming if we side with Crow. The words spread, stirring fear in every corner. Women wept at the thought of hungry children. Men clenched their jaws but kept their hands from their guns, unwilling to provoke Martha's wrath further. Ethan stood in the center of it all, listening, his face cut from stone. When Cole's voice cracked with shame, Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. You fought for your land, that's more than most. They didn't break you. Don't let 'em. Cole shook his head. One man can't stand against her, Crow. Not you, not anyone. Best thing is to leave before she buries us all. Ethan's reply was calm yet fierce. If I leave, she wins, and she'll bury you anyway. The only difference is whether you fight before you fall. That night, Ethan gathered those willing to listen at the half-dug well. Clara Boone stood at his side, her voice carrying across the crowd with steady conviction. Hollis brought his hammer, setting it down like a pledge of loyalty. The farmers and ranch hands who dared attend looked weary, yet their eyes burned with the faint glow of defiance. Martha uses fear because fear is all she has, Ethan told them. She burns fields to starve you, but fire can't feed her men forever. What she don't expect is for us to stand together. If we defend the land, if we protect each other, she can't rule with terror. One of the men in the crowd, a wiry farmer named Luke, called out, You think we can fight her army with pitchforks and tired backs? Ethan shook his head. Not with pitchforks. With preparation. With walls, with watchmen, with plans. A single man falling don't matter much. A whole town standing. That's a storm even Martha can't ride through. Clara stepped forward, her words soft but cutting deep. She lit fire to our children's school, to our crops, to our pride. We can't let her light fire to our spirit. If you believe in your land, in your families, then you believe in this fight. The crowd murmured, doubt and resolve colliding in every whisper. Slowly, men nodded, women clasped hands tighter, and something unspoken shifted. The fear was still there, but alongside it grew a seed of resistance. By midnight, Ethan stood watch on the ridge above town, the stars sharp as glass overhead. He could see torches flickering at distant ranches where Jed's men rode, shadows of violence stretching across the prairie. His hand rested on the Colt at his side, but for the first time the weapon felt less like survival and more like responsibility. Dead Man's Creek was no longer just a town he had ridden into. It was a town he was bound to defend. The heat of the following day pressed down like an iron lid, sealing Dead Man's Creek in a suffocating stillness. Yet beneath that stillness, tension crawled. Men sharpened tools into makeshift weapons, women hauled buckets for the new well, and children whispered Ethan Crow's name, as though it carried both danger and hope. For the first time in years, the town was beginning to stir against Martha Hargrove's grip. But shadows grew fastest when light appeared. Near sundown, Ethan entered the saloon, not for whiskey, but for words. Hollis, Clara, and a handful of others had urged him to speak openly, to remind the town that their strength lay in unity. He stepped through the smoke-thick air, eyes narrowing as conversations stilled. "Folks," Ethan began, voice steady, "I ain't here to ask you to pick up arms for me. I'm asking you to pick 'em up for yourselves, for your land, for your children. Martha feeds on fear, but if we starve her of it, she's just a woman with money and men, no more, no less." For a moment the saloon was quiet, save for the creak of chairs and the shuffle of boots. Then a voice rose sharp from the back, cutting through the hush. "Don't believe him?" Heads turned. A man stepped forward, wiry and pale, his eyes darting like a rat's. His name was Sawyer, once a ranch hand, now a drunk who owed more debts to Martha than he could ever pay back. He waved a crumpled parchment in the air, the ink smudged but legible. "This here's a bounty poster," Sawyer shouted, slamming it on the bar. "Ethan Crow, wanted outlaw, bank robber, thief. You all think he's a savior? He's nothing but a killer hiding behind a preacher's words." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some drew back, others whispered fiercely. Clara's face blanched, though her jaw clenched in anger. Ethan remained still, though his chest tightened. He had known this secret would not stay buried forever, but betrayal still cut sharp. Sawyer pressed on, eyes glittering with triumph. "He don't care about you. He don't care about your children or your land. He's using you to hide from the rope waiting for his neck. Martha promised gold for proof of his past, and I aim to collect it." The saloon roared with divided voices. Some cursed Ethan's name, demanding answers. Others shouted Sawyer down, reminding the crowd of the children saved from fire. Fists slammed tables, chairs scraped the floor, and the air thickened with the threat of violence. Ethan raised his voice above the storm. "It's true," he said, steady as stone. The room stilled, stunned by his admission. "I rode with outlaws once. Young, foolish, hungry for coin. A bank was robbed, blood was spilled. I've carried that stain every mile since. But I walked away from it, swore never to draw iron for greed again. That past ain't my future unless you let Martha make it so." Clara's voice rang out sharp, slicing through the murmurs. "You call him a thief, yet he risked his life for our children. You call him a killer, yet he's the only man who's fought for your freedom without asking a dime. Judge him for what he's done here, not for what he left behind." Her words lit sparks, but doubt lingered. Men avoided Ethan's gaze, torn between gratitude and fear. Sawyer sneered, spitting into the dirt. "You'll regret putting your faith in him," Sawyer hissed. "Martha'll see to that." The saloon erupted again, division as wide as the desert itself. Ethan stepped back, his heart heavy, yet his resolve hardening. Trust had been broken and Martha had gained her advantage, but the fight was far from finished. Night had fallen heavy over Dead Man's Creek, the kind of darkness that swallowed even the bravest whispers. The saloon's chaos still echoed in Ethan Crow's ears. Sawyer's betrayal, the townsfolk's doubt, Clara's fierce defense. He walked the empty street with the weight of every step pressing deeper, each one dragging the memory of his outlaw past back into the light. By morning the air was sharp with tension. Ethan stood near the churchyard, the half-dug well yawning like a wound at his feet. Men gathered at a distance, their faces guarded. Women pulled children closer, unsure whether to greet him as a savior or cast him out as a criminal. Finally, Hollis the blacksmith spoke, his deep voice steady. "Is it true? Every word Sawyer spat last night?" Ethan drew a long breath. "It's true I rode with men who robbed banks. True I carried a gun for the wrong reasons. I won't deny it, won't hide it. I've lived with the shame too long already. His eyes swept the crowd, unflinching. But that man died on the trail years ago. What stands before you now ain't looking for gold. I'm looking for something worth more than coin. Freedom for me and for you. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels passing on the far road. Doubt lingered, but Clara Boone stepped forward, her voice fierce with conviction. "You've seen him with your own eyes," she said. "You saw him drag children from the fire when others stood frozen. You saw him face Jed and his men when every instinct said to run. A man's past can tell you where he's been, but his choices show you who he is now. And this man chose us." Her words hung in the air, weaving through the crowd like a thread. Some shifted uncomfortably, but others lifted their heads, considering. A rancher named Cole, whose fields had been burned, stepped closer. "My land's ash," Cole muttered. "But I reckon Sawyer never would have risked his neck for my children." Crow did. "That counts for something." A murmur of agreement followed, faint but growing. Still others shook their heads, unwilling to forget the bounty poster's ink. Ethan raised his voice again, calm yet sharp. "I won't beg you to trust me. Trust can't be begged. It's earned. All I'll say is this. Martha's coming. Not tomorrow, not next week. She'll come soon, and she'll come hard. When she does, you'll need someone willing to stand. I'll be here whether you stand beside me or not." The crowd broke apart slowly, some offering nods, others casting suspicious glances. The division cut deep, but the seed Clara had planted held fast in a few hearts. Later, as the sky bruised into twilight, Clara found Ethan by the ridge above town. He sat with his hat resting on his knee, the desert stretching endless before him. "You spoke plain," she said softly. "That's more than most men would have dared." Ethan's voice was low, heavy with the gravel of regret. "Plain words don't wash away sins, Clara. Maybe they shouldn't." Clara's gaze softened. "No, but they can build something new from the ashes. Redemption ain't about forgetting the past. It's about choosing a different road forward." Her words settled into him, like water easing cracks in dry earth. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something shift deep within. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the chance of it. As the wind swept dust across the prairie, Ethan lifted his gaze toward the horizon. The fight with Martha loomed near, heavy as storm clouds, and this time he would face it not as an outlaw hiding from his past, but as a man willing to bear it for the sake of something greater. Dawn broke hard and red, the horizon painted like a wound. Dead Man's Creek held its breath, the town quieter than a graveyard. Doors stayed shut, windows latched, yet behind every crack of wood or curtain eyes watched the street. Today was the day. Everyone knew it. Ethan Crow stood at the well with Clara Boone and Hollis at his side. His hat was low, his revolver strapped, his shoulders heavy with more than dust. He felt the air thick with dread, but under it thrummed a pulse of something else. Resolve. Clara's hand brushed the Bible she held close, her lips moving in silent prayer. Hollis gripped his hammer, knuckles white, jaw tight as iron. The sound came first. Hooves. Dozens of them, pounding the earth like drums of war. A column of riders appeared on the horizon, the sun glinting off rifles and pistols. At their front, seated high in her black wagon, was Martha Hargrove. Her bulk filled the seat like a throne, her eyes sharp and merciless. Beside her rode Jed, rifle across his lap, a sneer twisting his mouth. They stopped in the center of town, dust swirling around them like smoke. Martha's voice rolled out, strong as a cannon blast. "Last chance, Crow. Bend that proud neck and maybe I'll let these folk crawl back into their holes. Stand, and I'll bury this town with you." Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady though his chest burned. "You don't own them, Martha. Not their hands, not their hearts. And you sure as hell don't own me." The crowd stirred in doorways and windows, murmurs rising like sparks. Martha's face hardened, her hand slicing the air. "Kill him." Gunfire erupted. The crack of rifles split the morning. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Ethan dove behind the trough, Colt drawn, firing back with quick, measured shots. Hollis swung his hammer at a rider who charged too close, the blow sending man and horse sprawling. Clara pulled children into the church, shielding them from the chaos. The street became thunder and smoke. Jed's rifle barked sharp, bullets whistling past Ethan's ear. Ethan rolled, firing twice, forcing Jed to duck. Their eyes locked across the haze, nephew and outlaw, predator and prey. Jed dismounted, stalking toward Ethan with the swagger of a man who believed himself unbeatable. "This is where you die, Crow," he snarled. "Then come earn it," Ethan replied. The two circled in the dust, the town holding its breath. Jed raised his rifle, but Ethan moved quicker, his Colt flashing. The first shot clipped Jed's shoulder, spinning him sideways. He roared, lunging forward, swinging the rifle like a club. Ethan ducked, the blow grazing his hat, and drove his fist into Jed's jaw. The crack of bone echoed, but Jed barely faltered, rage burning brighter than pain. They clashed in a blur of fists and steel, grit filling their mouths, blood staining the dust. Finally, Jed raised his rifle to fire, point blank, but Ethan's Colt barked once more. The bullet tore through Jed's chest, his eyes widened in shock, then dulled as he crumpled into the dirt. A hush fell over the battlefield. Martha's scream tore through it, raw and furious. She rose in her wagon, pointing a jeweled finger at Ethan. "You'll pay for that. You'll pay with your life and theirs." But something had shifted. The townsfolk, once frozen by fear, surged forward. Farmers with pitchforks, ranch hands with pistols, women with stones in their fists. They poured into the street, striking at Martha's riders. The tide turned, fear replaced by fury. Martha's men faltered, retreating under the weight of a town no longer willing to kneel. Martha herself sat frozen, her power unraveling before her eyes as Ethan leveled his Colt at her wagon. The battle was ending, but the reckoning was only beginning. The dust of battle hung heavy in the air, the acrid stench of gunpowder mingling with the morning heat. Dead Man's Creek was no longer silent. It pulsed with shouts, the cries of victory, and the groans of the wounded. Martha's riders, once so sure of their power, scattered in retreat, leaving behind rifles, horses, and the weight of their defeat. In the center of the street stood Ethan Crow, chest heaving, Colt still in his hand. Across from him, Martha Hargrove sat frozen in her wagon, the jewels on her fingers trembling as she gripped the armrest. For the first time in years, she faced not a bowed crowd, but a town standing tall against her shadow. Ethan's voice carried steady across the street. "It's over, Martha." Her eyes burned with rage, but beneath it flickered something else. Fear. "You think one skirmish ends me? I built this town, I fed it. Without me, it'll starve." Clara Boone stepped forward, her dress torn, soot smudging her face, but her voice rang clear. "You fed on it, Martha. You bled it dry and called it Providence. No more. This town belongs to its people now." A murmur rose among the crowd. Hollis hefted his hammer, standing firm. Cole, the rancher, raised his voice. "We've bent long enough. We'll dig our well, mend our fences, and work our land. We'll do it without you." Martha's lips trembled, fury cracking into disbelief. She searched the faces around her, but no one moved to her defense. The spell she had cast for years was broken. Ethan holstered his Colt and stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. "You can stay and face their justice, or you can ride out and never look back. Either way, your reign here is finished." For a long moment Martha sat stiff, her pride warring with the truth laid bare before her. Finally she gave a bitter laugh, hollow and sharp. "Fine. Keep your dusty town. It'll choke you soon enough." She snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, wheels groaning as it rolled out of Dead Man's Creek. The crowd parted, watching her leave in silence until the dust swallowed her figure whole. The stillness that followed was deep, broken only by the sighs of relief and the faint rustle of the wind through scorched timbers. Slowly people began to smile, to speak, to place hands on one another's shoulders. The fear that had shackled them for so long was gone, leaving space for something new. Hope. Clara turned to Ethan, her eyes soft yet bright. "It's done. You gave them back their courage." Ethan shook his head. "They gave it back to themselves. I only reminded them it was still there." Hollis clapped him on the shoulder, his voice rough with emotion. "Still, Crow, this town owes you more than it can ever pay." Ethan looked down the street where children now chased one another across the dirt, their laughter carrying like a hymn. For the first time in years, his chest felt lighter, though the weight of his past still lingered like a scar. He had not erased it, but he had chosen differently, and in that choice he had found redemption. As the sun climbed higher, painting the town in new light, Clara stood beside him. "What will you do now?" Ethan smiled faintly, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. "Guess I'll stay. Dead Man's Creek ain't much, but it's got a future worth riding for. And I reckon I've done enough running." The town stirred with life behind them, voices weaving into a chorus of renewal. Ethan Crow had ridden into Deadman's Creek as a stranger marked by shadows. He remained as a man with purpose, no longer a drifter, but a part of something larger than himself. Before we close this story, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more tales like this, of courage, redemption, and the fight for freedom. And don't stop here. Click on the next video that's on your screen to keep riding with us into another story.